Hey, everyone. Good morning. Happy Monday. It's Naomi Wolf, and I am reading my essay from CPAC, or based on what I experienced at CPAC, um, called Covering President Donald Trump at CPAC, Notes from a Former Political Consultant. And as you'll see, I drew on my experience in the past as a political consultant to evaluate President Trump's speech at CPAC. Here you go. Don't be offended. Well, you can be offended if you want. We have the First Amendment, but these are my views. This is one of those essays I fear to write. I fear that those who are passionate admirers of President Trump will take umbrage at my notes about his recent speech at CPAC, and that those who are appalled at the mere mention of his name will be even angrier at me than they usually are, as in this essay, I treat him seriously as a presidential candidate. As you may know, I used to be a political consultant for President Clinton's reelection campaign and for Vice President Gore's 2000 presidential campaign. Before I was a consultant, I was a White House spouse. My then husband was a speechwriter for both President Clinton and for Mrs. Clinton. I became familiar from an observer's distance with the intense cycle of presidential speechwriting and revision. Then I became a consultant and a participant in observing the speechwriting process myself. Though I signed NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and thus can't discuss the details of my work for either campaign, I can speak generally about what I learned, about what can be helpful for a candidate for the presidency, and about the common stumbling blocks that face all candidates for that U.S. office. I also learned from both roles about the message process. This is the daunting task that a team of media specialists undertakes of getting the press corps to cover what is actually in the speech, ideally focusing their stories on the policy centerpiece of the speech, rather than running stories that elide the speech altogether to focus on some random clickbait. It was extraordinary for me to learn how often the National Press Corps simply does not report on the contents of a president's or a candidate's speeches, no matter how important the content is, or even run a link to the transcript, but will rather run stories about the speech occasion that are really about the audience or a recent scandal or a poll or whatever the First Lady is wearing. For speech by a US president or presidential candidate to be successful, that is, covered accurately in the media with the main points highlighted, and ideally to push the agenda or polls and to be remembered positively by posterity, the message team must also follow certain methodologies in the production of the speech and its distribution to the press. And after that, the advance team, the people who execute the mechanics of the principal's appearance at the venue, prepare the green room, deliver the candidate physically, seat the press, seat VIPs, launch the music, light the stage, distribute press materials, must also take certain steps with care. After all of this preparation, the candidate or the president, him or herself, must be disciplined in giving the speech as a performance to a live crowd. He or she must not yield to the strong temptations to pander to the crowd, to extemporize in damaging ways, to go on too long in response to rapturous audience reactions, to pursue rabbit holes tangential to the momentum of the speech, or to take defensive swipes at critics. This refusal to be tempted, of course, in all of these and other ways, and to stay, as we say, on message, is called in that world, quote, message discipline. And forgive me for trying to get more comfortable. In my role as a visiting professor of rhetoric at George Washington University, where I taught the history of advocacy rhetoric, I learned what it was that made for great public speeches in Western history in general. My findings from the research I did there, combined with what I learned from other roles I mentioned, confirmed that the elements of a great public speech in the West, and certainly a great presidential speech or campaign speech in America, are systematic and universal. A great public speech in the West one that is memorable and effective and changes the listener so that he or she wishes to support that leader's vision, shares certain key attributes. By the same token, presidential or presidential candidate speeches fail no matter what the principal's background or political orientation is for similar reasons. Briefly, 1, great public speeches must have a clear introduction. Within the first few paragraphs, the audience must know, what is this speech about? What is the thesis statement of this speaker? As they ask in Journalism 101, who, what, where, when? Here is 5th century BCE Athenian statesman Pericles' great oration upon the death of Athenian historian and general Thucydides. And now, everyone, bear with me. I've gotten comments about this essay that it's long. It is a bit long, but it's really important. It was really important to me to share with you all some of the actual rhetoric of the great speeches of the past because they inform our tradition. Quote, I will speak first of our ancestors, for it is right and seemly that now, when we are lamenting the dead, a tribute should be paid to their memory. And listen if you recognize anything here. There has never been a time when they did not inhabit this land, which by their valor they have handed down from generation to generation, and we have received from them a free state. But if they were worthy of praise, still more were our fathers, who added to their inheritance, and after many a struggle transmitted to us, their sons, this great empire. And we ourselves, assembled here today, who are still most of us in the vigor of life, have carried the work of improvement further and have richly endowed our city with all things so that she is sufficient for herself both in peace and war. But before I praise the dead, I should like to point out by what principles of action we rose to power and under what institutions and through what manner of life our empire became great. And of course, as you're listening, if you've read the Gettysburg Address, you can hear the echoes of this oration in President Lincoln's 1863 Gettysburg Address. Quote, our form of government does not enter into rivalry with the institutions of others. Our government does not copy our neighbors, but is an example to them. It is true that we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But while there exists equal justice to all and alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognized. And when a citizen is in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service, not as a matter of privilege, but as the reward of merit. Neither is poverty an obstacle, but a man may benefit his country, whatever the obscurity of his position, of his condition. While we are thus unconstrained in our private business, a spirit of reverence pervades our public acts. We are prevented from doing wrong by respect for the authorities and for the laws, having a particular regard to those which are ordained for the protection of the injured, as well as those unwritten laws which bring upon the transgressor of them the reprobation of the general sentiment. Because of the greatness of our city, the fruits of the whole earth flow in upon us, so that we enjoy the goods of other countries as freely as our own. And I took the liberty of sharing those two substantial paragraphs with you because that is the DNA of our system. He's spelling out, 400 and something years before the birth of Christ, what the DNA of democracy is. And that's where the West comes from. That's where our values, our sense of meritocracy, our respect for the law, our idea of the sacredness of the rule of law, all of that derives from Athens in the 5th century. And if your kid is not learning this by middle school, something is very wrong with his or her education. Now, this is me again. From these two paragraphs, Pericles' audience understood that while the occasion was Thucydides' funeral, the subject was Athenian democracy in relation to themselves and its corollary, civic freedom, its practice, impact, and resonance. By using this occasion to mourn as an occasion also to remind Athenians that generations before them had fought to preserve their civic liberty, and by noting that the freedoms and public life they inherited protect and benefit them, Pericles reinforced his listeners into a civic community with shared values of utmost importance. That action of community reinforcement is a key purpose of a successful US presidential speech. A great American presidential speech should remind Americans of their story, their place in the generations, and the need for them always to recommit as a community to the practice and defense of freedom. 2, a great presidential speech must have a clear structure. The listener must always know where he or she is within the unfolding of the argument. This gives the speech a sense of momentum. John F. Kennedy's inaugural address is a good example of a presidential speech with a mappably clear structure. President Kennedy, as many know, was a devoted reader of the classics. The central premise of President Kennedy's inaugural address is that he is renewing, like Pericles, ancestral vows to defend freedom. In the center of his address, he offers a series of pledges. The pledges have to do with foreign policy. They spell out the post-war role of the United States as the global beacon and template of liberty. They identify, though in poetic language that owes much to Pericles and other Athenian orators, a clear international policy that rewards freedom-oriented post-colonial nation states and threatens to deter tyrannies. Quote, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price." Listen to the rhythm here. "We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty. This much we pledge and more. To those allies whose cultural and spiritual origins we share, we pledge the loyalty of faithful friends. United, there is little we cannot do in a host of cooperative ventures. Divided, there is little we can do, for we dare not meet a powerful challenge at odds and split asunder. To those new states whom we welcome to the ranks of the free, we pledge our word that one form of colonial control shall not have passed away merely to be replaced by a far more iron tyranny. We shall not always expect to find them supporting our view, but we shall always hope to find them strongly supporting their own freedom, and to remember that in the past, those who foolishly sought power by riding the back of the tiger ended up inside. That is a threat. It's a civilized and delicate threat, but it is a clear threat. That's me talking. Now I'm picking up again. To those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves for whatever period is required, not because the communists may be doing it, not because we seek their votes, but because it is right. If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. To our sister republics south of our border, we offer a special pledge to convert our good words into good deeds in a new alliance for progress, to assist free men and free governments in casting off the chains of poverty. But this peaceful revolution of hope cannot become the prey of hostile powers. Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house. Again, this is me talking. Powerful geopolitical threat. Don't mess with North or South America. Picking up again. Finally, to those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace before the dark powers of destruction unleashed by science engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. End quote. Now, I mean, you can hear that he is itemizing a policy agenda for global global policy for his administration. But it is phrased very clearly and yet poetically with item after item after item. We're not going to do it for newly free countries. We're not going to, look after them. We're not a global police force. We're not going to keep feeding them forever. They have to help themselves. However, North and South America is not going to be the puppet or toy of communists. Don't mess with us. And the last sentence is a very elegantly veiled threat, reminding the Soviet Union at that time and China, but certainly primarily the Soviet Union, that everyone was a nuclear power at that point. And that if you threaten aggression to the United States too can threaten aggression right back at you. However, that is not how he ended it. From Kennedy's inaugural address, usually the only remembered phrase is near the conclusion, quote, and listen to the music here, listen to the rhythm of the words. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, our fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, period, end quote. Right? Have you gotten chills yet? It's so beautiful. And listen, those of you who learned about scansion, I hope by middle school, meaning how poetry works, that's iambic pentameter in there. It's da dun da dun da dun da dun da dun. And the great like Shakespeare's sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. You can literally scan the melody of some of these sentences as if it's poetry. All right. And there's been very interesting analyses of iambic pentameter. Why is it so beautiful and memorable? Because it corresponds to the human breath. Isn't that gorgeous? However, this extraordinarily memorable phrase that 4 subsequent generations have used to summarize the hopeful idealism and spirit of national unity of Camelot would not have been so easy to lift out if the inaugural speech itself, which is only 1,366 words long, were not so crisply structured. 3, the successful presidential or candidate speech must clearly spell out the policies proposed. President Clinton was elected in 1992, and his early speeches were a nightmare. They were wonky, a word that seemed coined specifically for him and his policy team. They were wordy and circular and repetitive, and worst sin of all, they used insider jargon, more suitable to a Columbia University economics seminar than to a speech for Americans from every walk of life. President Clinton's popularity was at its lowest, and his media critics were at their most effective when his speeches had these burdens of language, because the people literally could not understand what he was saying. The whiff of elitism embedded in this kind of language didn't help him either. When people don't understand or like a president's speeches, it creates a media vacuum. And then scandal, rumor, gossip, sniping, and nonsense enter the void and dominate the press's coverage of that presidency. By 1996 State of the Union address, President Clinton had become much better at speaking in plain English and in presenting an organized policy list in simple terms. President Clinton used the opening paragraphs of his State of the Union, the top real estate rhetorically, to showcase indisputable statistics and concrete benchmarks. Quote, "The State of the Union is strong. Our economy is the healthiest it has been in 3 decades. We have the lowest combined rates of unemployment and inflation in 27 years. We've created nearly 8 million new jobs, over 1 million of them in basic industries like construction and automobiles. America is selling more cars than Japan for the first time since the 1970s. And for 3 years in a row, we have had a record number of new businesses started in our country." Our leadership in the world is also strong, bringing hope for new peace. And perhaps most important, we are gaining ground in restoring our fundamental values. The crime rate, the welfare and food stamp rolls, the poverty rate, and the teen pregnancy rate are all down, period, end quote. Now, I don't love that language. It's pretty boring. It's hard to get excited about, but it does put some facts on the record. He then parsed the speech cleanly into 7, quote, challenges to, quote, strengthen America's families, end quote, to provide Americans with, quote, educational opportunities, quote, to help every American who's willing to work for it achieve economic security, quote, to take our streets back from crime and gangs and drugs, quote, to leave our environment safe and clean for the next generation, quote, to maintain America's leadership in the fight for freedom and peace throughout the world, and lastly, quote, to reinvent our government and make our democracy work for citizens. Each challenge subhead in the lingo, was buttressed by his itemization of specific accomplishments of his administration, ranging from a voucher system for retraining for new jobs to Congress banning gifts and meals from lobbyists, to the shrinking of the federal budget under his watch, to his signing an executive order to deny federal contracts to businesses that hired illegal immigrants. By the way, that's an interesting approach to recapture in our current crisis. Most remembered from this speech, what most remembered from this speech was his third way approach to welfare reform. Quote, I say to those who are on welfare, and especially to those who've been trapped on welfare for a long time, for too long, our welfare system has undermined the values of family and work instead of supporting them. The Congress and I are near agreement on sweeping welfare reform. I challenge this Congress to send me a bipartisan welfare reform bill that will really move people from welfare to work and do the right thing by our children. I will sign it immediately, period, end quote. Some reporters made fun of his granular approach, this itemization of his achievements and goals down to the level of the details around banning meals for lobbyists. Others criticized him for being policy-oriented at the expense of soaring rhetoric. But I would say that these down-to-earth, well-structured lists of easy-to-understand mainstream policy goals and results saved his presidency. Because the man or woman in the street could understand President Clinton's speeches and could thus credit his administration for working hard to get deliverables to them and their families, the precious swing voters that any candidate needs in order to win, that's a very important sentence, voted him in twice, the second time with an even greater margin. As importantly, the coverage of his speeches actually often included these easy to lift out, bullet-pointed lists of real outcomes. These Clintonian speeches coincided, I would say not randomly, with the high points of his popularity. They gave him, in my view, some of the political capital in the bank that allowed him to survive the sexual scandal and impeachment that broke the following years. Finally, number 4, the greatest presidential speeches, and I'm getting to President Trump, so don't go away. The greatest presidential speeches must have clear and poetic imagery and tell stories. President Reagan was called the great communicator. Credit for this should really go to his gifted speechwriter, Peggy Noonan. It was she who brought the uplifting, poetic language into Reagan's most remembered speeches. A beautiful example is the speech that President Reagan gave upon the 1986 explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which killed, quote, 7 heroes, 7 male and female astronauts on live television. Like some of the greatest American presidential speeches, this elegy was very brief, only 648 words. It owes a great deal to the Gettysburg Address of 1863, which in turn also owes a great deal to Pericles' funeral oration, as I shared earlier. The Challenger speech, offered to a shocked and mourning nation, concluded with an unforgettable image directly lifted from a poem titled High Flight by John Gillespie Magee, Jr. Quote, the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God, period, end quote. And listen again to that iambic pentameter. slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. I mean, you can literally map it. That's called an iamb. An iamb is da 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 da, and pentameter means there are 5 beats. Da 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 da. Right? I'm sure many of you know that, but it's always worth remembering. Why do I recap the high points of my class on the history of rhetoric and my findings from my consultant's life about what makes a great presidential speech? And now I'm getting to the current moment. Because I watched President Trump speak at CPAC. It was the second time I'd heard him in person, and I have some perhaps unasked for notes. I am not partisan, but as you know, I think our country is in dreadful trouble. I think it has already been captured. In my view, any non-globalist nationalist candidate running in 2024 should be heard as loudly and clearly as possible so that citizens can make the best possible choices this fall. President Trump is in many ways a great speaker. The crowds that assembled to watch him in the massive ballroom of the Gaylord Hotel were ecstatic, but there were, in my opinion, addressable problems and real missed opportunities in his speech. First of all, it's difficult for me as a reporter trying to cover the speech to tell you what he said in terms of the meat of it, the substance. He came onto the stage after pounding pop and country hits had energized the audience, looking fit and well. He wore his signature navy blue suit with boxy shoulders, white shirt and red tie. His hair was more gray than red blonde. He looked less like a celebrity and more presidential. The crowd was screaming with joy. But if I were his consultant, I would have observed that crowd's ecstasy with mixed satisfaction and alarm. His live audience's impact on his own delivery style and his choices on stage is not necessarily good for his outcomes this fall. President Trump spoke scathingly about the failures of the Biden administration, the poverty and homelessness in our cities, crime and lawlessness, and the open border. He vividly painted, mostly extemporaneously, a picture of the ruin and degradation in just 4 years of a once great nation. However, when he turned to his own plans for his second administration, he was far less specific. He essentially said at one point that his main policy objective for his next administration was, quote, to make America great again, end quote. This got a roar of approval from the audience, but it was not answer enough, I would argue, for the undecided or swing voter or for the homeless former Democrat. President Trump was very clear on some of his themes and plans, but quite vague or rhetorical when it came to others. He was strong on his past achievements and his future plans in terms of foreign policy. He told again the story, and it is a satisfying story, of how he had used the threat of tariffs to get Mexico to provide military security at our southern border. He was extremely detailed about how he will close the borders and deport the illegal aliens who have entered our country by the millions. But even with this discussion, his language is often anecdotal and personal with almost no analysis. He presented a series of meetings with, quote, tough leaders who reacted well to his own, quote, toughness. Swing or undecided voters are in anguish about our environmental problems, but President Trump merely gestured at the environment, wanting to make America, quote, beautiful again, with almost no specifics. He claimed a strong economy in his past administration and promised, as I recall, a strong economy in the future. But it's difficult to recall any specific policy proposals he identified to achieve this. Unfortunately, in between what were far too few concrete descriptions of his past achievements for our nation, which I had learned only by looking them up directly earlier, had, to my surprise, been considerable, he often committed the kinds of rhetorical lapses that would give thoughtful, experienced advisors watching high blood pressure. He digressed. Oh, how he digressed. Some of his digressions were hilarious. For instance, he brilliantly told a self-deprecating story about landing in Air Force One in Iraq in a state of anxiety in total darkness. It was fall on the floor funny. It got peals of laughter. But there he left it. He had said earlier in the speech that he had started no new wars, which could be highlighted as a huge deliverable appealing to all voters. But he did not tie this anecdote to that larger point. Indeed, he tied that story to no larger point at all about Iraq or about fear or about conflict. If he had had a tough speech editor, the editor would have red penciled the anecdote. What point are you making here? Conclusion needed. President Trump took swipes at the obvious dementia of President Biden that were again meanly funny and that got big laughs. But he could have made that same point more sadly and gently. He could have thus gotten the votes of all those who worry about President Biden's mental state and also added the votes of all those who are caring for a loved one with dementia, which is not a small voter category. I registered, listening as a journalist, that those moments could be lifted out by the media, would be lifted out by the media to portray him negatively. He told hilarious anecdote after hilarious anecdote. The live audience loved him. His live audiences always adore him. That is not news. The CPAC crowd cherished the personal stories, the improv, the humor. But there were problems with his speech style for the rest of us. One issue is that such speeches guarantee poor press coverage. I, as a member of the press, watched nearly half an hour of his time go to hilarious anecdotes, repetitions, mean swipes, and charming jokes in such a chaotic and circular way that, as I noted, it's very difficult for me to write an article pinpointing exactly what his speech was about. The circularity, digressions, and repetitions also prevented the speech from having the liftoff that a great speech delivers, that sense of moving with the speaker through time to arrive at a new destination. If I were an advisor of his, and I am not angling for a job, just imagining his staff's tasks in handling him, I would be gritting my teeth at the half hour of digressions because they took up so much room that there was no systematic summary by the end of his time of what he had achieved for the country during his first 4 years, nor any clear projection of what he would do for us in the next 4 years. As noted, when the press can't lift out the bullet points of a speech, they fill the space under deadline with mean quotes, gossip, scandal, invective, and what President Trump calls fake news. But why needlessly give them the opportunity to do this? President Trump is not the only candidate whose best talents can be killed or diverted or suffocated with undue responsiveness to live audience love. President Clinton had similar faults. Both were or are so good with live audiences that they seduce and are seduced by the live audience, leaving the press and the viewers at home, who may not be so in love with the candidate, often bored or restless or unmoved. I watched the reaction of the press corps around me and observed my own internal responses. A meme, that circulated later on social media, a snapshot of a reporter playing a digital card game while covering President Trump's speech at CPAC, seemed to those who are sharing it like a criticism of the reporter in question. But speaking as a neutral observer and as a reporter, it's actually a criticism of the candidate. A great speech, or even just a substantive speech, will rivet any audience member, or even if he or she is politically opposed or neutral. During various flights of Trumpness that led the live audience into paroxysms of adoration, I felt the same sense of detachment as did the reporter who was playing digital hearts. Why? Because President Trump seemed to be speaking only to those who are already besotted and not making his case to the rest of America. The live audience at CPAC is not everyone. President Trump forgot, I felt, that he was speaking not just to his base, but potentially also to millions of undecided Americans who were watching from home. All candidates can fall into the trap of mirroring only the concerns and language of their bases and forget that most of the country has to vote for you if you are to win. And by the way, this is especially true for Donald Trump this fall because of the planned cheating that the Democrats have essentially confessed to by trying to block efforts to restrict voting to paper ballots and voter ID, and limited absentee ballots, limited people proactively asking for them. Many phrases that President Trump used at CPAC were right, perhaps just for his base, but wrong for a general audience. For instance, he did little to distinguish legal from illegal immigrants, which vagueness allowed the press inaccurately to call him, quote, anti-immigrant. Candidates for president in the past only became president when they solved this problem of moving from their appeal to the base, which population alone can never get you elected or even outdo the cheating margins, as I just mentioned, to an appeal to the moderate middle. An example of this evolution was when President Clinton moved from the language of welfare to welfare reform, or when candidate Bush II said about abortion, good people can disagree. The best and most influential speeches of Presidents Lincoln, Kennedy, Reagan, Clinton, and Bush II appealed to the us in Americans and were inclusive, not narrowly partisan. Think about all the great speeches or effective speeches I just read to you from the past. They all speak to the us in Americans. They all speak to us as if we are one unified country. There was another moment in which I thought President Trump burned political capital needlessly. He pointed directly at the media seated. He literally pointed his index finger at us far in the back of the ballroom and at the video and TV cameras too, and said that the fake media were corrupt. Not some in the media, not many in the media, but the fake media. Why do this? Certainly the legacy media have been and are usually corrupt in covering President Trump. I acknowledge this in my essay, Dear Conservatives, I Apologize. That moment of attacking the press, which I believe is repeated in other speeches of President Trump's, was pure red meat for the crowd. They howled with joy. But if I were advising President Trump, I would warn him against the temptation of catering to this live reaction. What if there were a few reporters in that ballroom who were open to writing positive or at least neutral stories about the speech? I was seated in the group that had the accusing finger pointed at us from the stage. It was an unpleasant experience, and it felt unjust. Not every reporter is corrupt. Also, power balances can shift in the course of a campaign, and an editor who has commissioned nothing but hit pieces in the past can shift to neutral or positive stories when the polls evolve. But the polls won't evolve much, and nasty coverage won't change if President Trump continues so flamboyantly to make a wholesale enemy out of all of the press as a category. Lastly, there were some miscalculations in my view by his advance team. One is that, as I mentioned, the press corps was seated at the far rear of the ballroom. It felt stigmatizing to be seated further away from the candidate than anyone else. Other campaigns seat the press up front or at the sides of the stage or even at the floor, on the floor at the foot of the stage. This has many advantages. One is that when photographers are seated at the foot of the stage, they are forced to shoot with their camera lenses angled upward. This angle reproduces a long-standing visual convention in art history and now in politics that portrays someone as heroic. If photographers are seated far away, rather than at the foot of the stage, they take level photographs and video of the candidate, and you can see that there. And then further down, compare the above to President Obama's imagery and President Clinton's, whose staffers forced photographers to shoot upward from below the podium. A very different kind of image. And there's President Clinton, also shot from below. This heroic angle, quote unquote, actually derives from classical imagery of leaders. Notice that heroes are always on plinths or on horseback, so that you're forced to look up at them. Aesthetics aside, there were other omissions that prevented positive or even substantive coverage of President Trump's CPAC speech. Our advance teams back in the 1990s would give press kits to all media present with a speech summary clearly presented and the bullet points and key quotes already lifted out. This gave reporters no excuse not to report what was in the speech. At CPAC, there were no such summary or bullet-pointed press kits distributed to us, to my knowledge at least, so a reporter heading back to his or her hotel would be forced to rely on wading through a transcript, rewatching the speech and taking notes, incredibly slow and laborious when one is on deadline, or else be driven to simply recycle. Again, gossip, innuendo, slander, and some quote from a random purported Nazi at CPAC if one could be found. My view of press coverage is that the subject always has a responsibility, at least to make it easy for the press to understand what was said. If the press has that summary in hand, I forgot to switch off notifications. If the press has that summary in hand and then smears or misreports the speech, that is fully on them. But if one leaves gaps such in press outreach, one bears some responsibility for poor or non-existent or fake news coverage of a candidate or a speech. And indeed, the reports of the CPAC speech were full of fake news. Rolling Stone's headline was, quote, self-proclaimed dissident Trump rails on Newsom, calls migrants' language a, quote, horrible thing. This is Rolling Stone's summary of the speech. Quote, the hour and a half rambling speech covered Trump's typical gamut where he touted his cognitive abilities while demeaning President Biden's, defended January 6th insurrectionists, ripped on the media, and preached a doomsday scenario if he is not reelected. He compared migrants to Hannibal Lecter, claiming, quote, they are terrorists who are, quote, killing our people, and a, quote, contagion, echoing his previous Hitler-like, quote, poison the blood rhetoric. Oh my gosh. Would you vote for someone who did all of this? Most Americans would not. So the CPAC speech itself is misrepresented grossly by this Rolling Stone summary. But also, it isn't. Unfortunately, President Trump was indeed so loose and anecdotal so often in his detours and riffs that these words could indeed be lifted out of the verbal spaghetti on the plate and presented thus damagingly out of context. Here's the Washington Post's transcript of the speech. You can see its discursiveness and treacherous lack of structure for yourself. And go ahead to my Substack, and you'll see the link right there, and you can read the transcript. Why not say many or some illegal immigrants are terrorists? Why not say many or some in the media are corrupt? I was there listening as President Trump did his jazz extemporaneous riff on the many languages of illegal immigrants. I knew when he said, quote, it's a horrible thing, that he was talking about the entire scenario that had preceded that statement, the invasions, the crimes, the lawlessness. But my reporter brain recognized the bingo moment. I knew that other reporters would lift out the phrase, it's a horrible thing, and relate it just to the immediately preceding sentences about foreign languages being spoken. And I knew with what aversion swing or undecided voters would hear that. Why make these careless lapses in specificity, which are so easy for a hostile press to exploit? Why, by not giving the press a tight printed speech with bullet points and summary, and by not training the candidate to stay on message, pave the way for President Trump's critics to dismiss him as, quote, rambling? Why, if you support this candidate's policies, make it so easy for his critics to smear him entirely? I am in the sad position of having seen President Trump twice and having been impressed wholly against my will by much of what he had to say. Most of the rest of the country has not had that experience. Their knowledge of him is filtered through this hostile media. He can win if he and his team prioritize message discipline, structure, and good advance work. That's Loki looking at the squirrels. His adoring base will send me angry emails now, no doubt. Quote, we love him just the way he is because he is real, end quote. Quote, he does not talk like politicians. That is why we love him, end quote. I am sure that that is true, but the rest of the country is not so all-embracing. And any good candidate with his or her speechwriter can attain a healthy balance, offering structure and adding flights of seeming but carefully vetted improvisation that do not get the candidate in trouble again and again with the press and with undecided voters. There is a way to improvise so that vagueness and rhetorical lapses do not drown out the overall very important policy message. I guess what I'm saying is that President Trump's speeches and speaking style do not do justice to his record of achievements and actually sometimes undermine many people's ability to understand and evaluate his record. President Trump, indeed any nationalist candidate running for US president in 2024, should take a careful look back at the great speeches of the past, including the great American presidential speeches. These candidates should, in my view, in my humble view, rein in their human inclinations to respond primarily to the swooning audiences that are live and to their devoted bases. They should remember that the great and successful US presidential candidates, and indeed the great US presidents, spoke with focus and discipline and strength and a sense of mission. And they did all of this by addressing the better angels of our nation as a whole and by issuing historic and future-oriented calls to duty and unity to all of the American people. That is my essay on covering President Trump at CPAC, and now I will look at your comments. Lots of comments. I know lots of people are mad, probably, and lots of people are not mad, because both mad and supportive comments are in my Substack, where I have a printed version of this essay. Fish Tank says, after warp speed, Fauci, Bolton, and lockdowns, I don't want to hire Trump again, voting independent. Jim Brown says, we are in deep trouble. Excuse me. Helm Matthews says, who gives a S about that orange racist serial lying insurrectionists? Okay, lots of trolls and bots are in these discussions. I'd like some more specificity. Whose speech is this? Not sure what. Oh, JFK, got it. All right. Yes. Sometimes it's hard to tell in a read speech what I'm citing, and that's why I always say quote and unquote when I'm lifting out someone else's text. Roscoe sings, my granddad says Clinton's advisors pulled him aside some way through his first term and said, basically, you're going to govern as a moderate or you're not getting reelected. That is correct. That's on the record. I'm not violating my NDA. That is correct. Trump had dinner at Mar-a-Lago with neo-Nazi Nick Fuentes and Kanye after the latter's own Nazi comments. MTG tried to cover for him, but Trump never explained, condemn Nick. I don't think. Interesting. And, as always, I would like to see, the primary sources, because as I've learned, there's so much kind of misinformation about RFK Jr. and about President Trump, and about Biden for that matter, negative about the first two, positive about the second, about the third. But I mean, that's what a good advisor will say, like every campaign I've ever worked, people say, don't meet with that person. And there's a whole kind of team that vets meetings and looks and does what's called opposition research, looking into, how could this be misused, or how could this be used against you? What are negative things in this person's background, so that the candidate never has to, deal with those kinds of things being thrown at him or her. It really causes a lot of friction when you have meetings with people. I mean, I deal with that when I go to an event and someone wants to take a picture of me and hand me something. Brian is always making sure, it's not a Nazi, KKK or someone that I'll regret being photographed with, or a book I'll regret being holding. Felix Audell says, situation at the border, how will it affect the election? That's a great question. I think it benefits Trump, certainly. I mean, he has a record of having understood what a threat an open southern border is and actually doing something about it. And we, my original reporting and others like Brian O'Shea's and JJ Carell's, Ben Berquam's initially, of course, he broke the mold documenting this. They've shown that it's actually Biden's policies and Kamala Harris's policies funding this invasion at the border. So that's going to help President Trump. However, immigrants who are legal vote, and again, that's why if I were President Trump's advisor, I would say, just say illegal versus immigrants versus legal immigrants. It's why alienate the immigrants' vote? Why not reach out to the legal immigrants, like my dad or my grandparents, who love this country, and many of whom would be very supportive. Trump is correct about the media, says anti-neocon. 99% of corporate journalists are corrupt. I mean, I sadly agree with you, but there's also a whole ecosystem of new and independent journalists. I'm one of them. Like, I'm the press, right? And I'm not corrupt. Glenn Greenwald is the press. I don't think he's corrupt. Matt Taibbi is the press. He's not corrupt. So many Substackers could be covering this speech, or people on Twitter, if they had the the themes to reproduce. We could be discussing his policies instead of his personality, is my point. And that would be better for the country, certainly also better for the Trump campaign. The Trump is a Nazi trope is so weak. Maybe, but all the more reason to not, again, play into it, right? Let's see. Darrett Neelan says Trump is more a wrench thrown into the works than a refined statesman or orator, at least at this point in time. Very true. But to be, I mean, I'm going to keep like fighting my corner here. To be an effective wrench in the works, which I want a wrench in the works because the works are genocidal at this point. I'm not partisan. I'm not endorsing any candidate. I just really want nationalist candidates to be able to have a fair chance in this election. And that includes RFK Jr. They have to be able to, again, communicate their platform and get a lot of swing voters to vote for them. And I can't say this enough. If you guys may really be annoyed by this, everyone loves their candidate when their candidate is speaking to the base, right? Everyone, conservatives love the conservative rhetoric, left-wing voters love the left-wing rhetoric, and everyone gets upset and angry. Everyone who's a passionately on the left or the right gets very upset and angry when a candidate moves to the center. But without moving to the center, and specifically without suburban white women, that demographic, and I would also say now added to that, I think a lot of Black voters and Latino voters, Hispanic voters are up for grabs, right? Without those populations, no one can win. You need the middle, and you need the middle in swing states in order to win. People really have to understand once and for all, presidential elections are decided. They aren't decided by your vote. If you live in a blue state or a red state, candidates take for granted that, Mississippi will be red and New York will be blue. Everyone on all sides does that math. What they're fighting for is 6 battleground states in the middle, and specifically that handful of suburban women in those 6 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera, who will vote, right? That's what decides the outcome of presidential elections. I'm sorry, that's just true. So that means that, we all have to kind of suck it up and not necessarily have the candidates we are supporting reflect every single thing in our wish list, because in order to win, they need to get the undecided voters, the swing voters in the battleground states. Guys, really, it means that, if you want President Trump to win, you can't force him to talk about abortion maybe the way you want to talk about abortion. If someone on the left wants RFK Jr. to win, you can't expect him to talk about, energy the way that you think he should talk about energy. Everyone needs to grow up and understand that these are, it's complex math, right? It's not simple math. It's, an example of this, like a lot of people will be mad at me, but an example of this is a lot of people want President Trump to disavow warp speed. And they're really angry at him for having supported warp speed. Well, in retrospect, obviously, it was a horrible thing. And it would be beautiful if he could give a speech acknowledging that this injection was a mistake. However, I do know from having observed presidents and vice presidents that no president can be expert on everything, and that presidents really do. There's so much. It's like being in the middle of like a giant fire hose is aimed at you from all sides, being in the White House. And no president is an expert on everything. It's just not possible, especially if it's specialized information like medicine or science. So they rely on their advisors. I mean, there's a reason that presidential advisors are it's a very elevated term to become a special advisor to the president. And he had all these special advisors who were highly credentialed, who lied and lied and lied and lied to him. So it would be beautiful if he disavowed it, but I'm just telling you, that's the kind of math where I think people should recognize that no president can be right about everything and look at the bigger picture. Same goes for people on the right. I'm sorry, on the left. I mean, I hope they look at the bigger picture. My mom in her left-wing news stream would say that President Trump is if he wins or if RFK Jr. wins, that we're in big trouble because there's no federal guarantee of abortion rights or gay marriage. That's what the new issue is. And that's it. That's an important issue. But people have to look at the big picture. And I mean, I hate the phrase lesser of two evils, but people have to grow up. And I'm now really talking to the left. You may think it's incredibly painful to vote for someone who doesn't agree with you about some of these issues, but put on your big boy and girl pants, because the alternative is we will have no country and we will have no democracy, and then we won't even get to have the arguments about abortion rights or gay marriage or solar power, right? But you can get someone in office who's not going to genocide you for a globalist agenda, and then you can, exert your pressure as a citizen to secure those rights in your state or to lobby that administration, which also works. Like, people also have to stop thinking that the wish list ends on election day. You need to be an active citizen. You need to know how to lobby your state elected official, and you need to know how to lobby your member of Congress and your president. And that way you keep having an influence on policies after election day and into reelecting, right? You always have leverage with reelection. So you need to keep making your voices heard and not think, oh, this candidate doesn't agree with me all the way down my wish list. I won't support him or her, or I won't vote, right? And if you don't vote in this election, I don't even want to talk to you ever again, because there's far too much at stake. All right. Okay. Anti-neocon says, I love RFK, but he's so wrong about econ and regulation. Interesting. Well, that's an interesting debate to have. Sword of Truth says, Palestine. I agree with you. People need to engage with Palestine. I don't think it's a simple answer, but one of the things I heard President Trump say when he was speaking to a group of Orthodox Jewish supporters in Bedminster, the only other time I've heard him speak, he pointed out that he brought peace to that region. The Abraham Accords, he brought peace to that region. And however you think we need to solve the war, or if you prefer the genocide, depending on your point of view, between Israel and Palestine right now, involving Gaza, peace is best for everyone. Peace is best for women. Peace is best for children. And it's amazing. Like, if I were his advisor, I'd be like, you know what? Abraham Accords, no foreign wars, strong economy. That's your message. That's your message. Leave it there. Freedom that's your message. And I would keep it simple. That's one of the biggest things. No one's been able to solve the Middle East conflict. Not any president in my lifetime. President Trump did more to do that. And again, he buries the lead, as we say in journalism. He does not lead with that. And I think he should. I think he could protect civilians on both sides. I do. I think that. Now everyone will hate me on the left, but I do believe that. Let's see. Tina Marie says, I'm upset about the way he was railroaded by Fauci. Duly noted. He totally was. And you guys also have to understand that for legal reasons, presidents can't speak as freely as you and I can. So he's probably not going to say, Tony Fauci lied to me, or Deborah Birx lied to me, because he's got all the lawfare he can handle and more right now. So again, voters, I hope you have listened to this podcast with an open mind. Whether you agree or not, let me know your thoughts. I should stop there. This has been really fascinating. Thank you for your comments. I really want everyone to please, vote like a grown-up, find out what someone's real record is. Think about what's at stake as we are facing one of the most dangerous years in our history. I don't know if America will survive after 2024. And don't take legacy media as your end point, right? It is so filtered and corrupted. Seek out independent media. We tell the truth on Daily Clout. There are other sites that tell the truth. And please support independent media. And one way you can do that is by supporting our wonderful sponsors who made this podcast possible. The Wellness Company. So go to twc.health and enter promo code DailyClout for 10% off. And Charlotte's Beauty, a non-toxic beauty, no carcinogens. And you go to charlottes.beauty, promo code outspoken. Charlottes.beauty, promo code outspoken for 25% off. We can only keep bringing you this completely honest, unmediated, thorough reporting if you support us or support our sponsors. If you want to make a donation at Daily Clout, please do become a member. Go to dailyclout.io and you can subscribe to me as a subscriber on Outspoken. All of that helps us. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.